How these papers have been placed in sequence will be made manifest in the reading of them. All needless matters have been eliminated, so that a history almost at variance with the possibilities of later-day belief may stand forth as simple fact. There is throughout no statement of past things wherein memory may err, for all the records chosen are exactly contemporary, given from the standpoints and within the range of knowledge of those who made them. And that was the very first paragraph of Dracula on a standalone page at the beginning. And if that doesn't hook you, I don't know what will. That hook reminded me an awful lot of a Law and Order episode where at the beginning they go, these are the facts, this is the law system, and these are the stories of the men and women involved. And then it goes, dun, dun, dun. That's what that reminds me of exactly. It captured me pretty much immediately. Hello, my name is Alethea Thomas. Welcome to my YouTube channel. This is my review of Dracula. This is part of the Classics series, where I am exploring classics because I never really read a lot of classics before. There is a list of classics that I am going to be attempting to read. Probably not all of them, and with, a couple of exceptions. I'm probably going to add in some different books, take out some other books, just depends. My very, very first video on that, I will try to go ahead and link it here if you're interested in going and viewing that. But I also have the list in the description down below. It is a list from the Oxford School, from their English department, I believe. And it is a list of classics that they usually require their students to read. So I thought that was a really good starting point. So let's start with Dracula. I am an absolute Dracula nerd. So I pretty much love the book from the beginning, but we'll get to that in a minute. So we're going to go over kind of an introduction to the text, a little bit of background around it. So then we're going to go over the characters. We'll talk about the plot of the story, and then my thoughts about the story, and that will be the end of the review at that point. We might chat a little bit afterwards as well. I usually can't shut up. I'm a chatty Cathy. So let us begin with the introduction and background to the text. So Bram Stoker, he was an English author and playwright. He was the acting manager of the Lyceum Theatre in London and was an assistant to the actor Henry Irving. Stoker wrote primarily to make a living, and he produced sensational novels and romances. He published 18 books before his death in 1912, and he published Dracula in 1897. The tale of Dracula was told in the form of an epistolary novel, where the story is told through a series of letters, journals, diary entries, newspaper clippings, and other documents. There's no singular protagonist in this story, and it's told from multiple points of view. Dracula is one of the most famous pieces of English literature. Many of the book characters have entered popular culture as archetypal versions of their characters. For example, Dracula is the quintessential vampire, and Van Helsing has become an iconic vampire hunter. The novel, and it's in the public domain, and it has been adapted for film over 30 times, and its characters have made numerous appearances in virtually all media. The reception of the text, and when it was actually published, was very good, actually. There was a lot of praise for the novel. It was praised as a great example of horror and a great way to actually write horror. The criticism around it was mostly because people thought it was too scary, too frightening to actually to read and to recommend to other people, because it just, for the Victorian era, very, very scary material. Scary stuff. So we'll talk about the characters really quickly. Jonathan Harker, he's a newly qualified English solicitor. A solicitor in American terms is a lawyer. He travels to Transylvania to meet with the mysterious Count Dracula, and provide him with paperwork on the purchase of an English property. Count Dracula, he is an undead, centuries-old vampire and a Transylvanian nobleman, and he claims to be Sveki, descending from Attila the Hun, and he inhabits a decaying castle in the Carpathian Mountains near the Borgo Pass. Unlike the vampires of Eastern European folklore, he is portrayed as handsome and charismatic, while those are often portrayed as repulsive and corpse-like. He has an aristocratic charm, and in his conversations with Jonathan, he reveals himself as deeply proud of his heritage and nostalgic for the past, which he admits has become only a memory of heroism, honor, and valor in modern times. Sorry, I've had a cat down there. Away with you, feline. Mina Murray is Jonathan's fiancée and becomes worried when Jonathan is gone for months without sending messages. Lucy Westerna is Mina Murray's best friend, and they exchange many letters. Lucy is sweet, childish, and in love with the idea of being in love. Lucy was proposed to by 3 men on the same day, and they're the following gentlemen. Dr. John Seward, who is a head doctor of an insane asylum, and Dr. Seward conducts many interviews with his patient, Renfield, and he's trying to better understand Renfield's particular insanity. Quincy Morris is an American cowboy type character, and he's visiting England. And Quincy is very athletic and a very attractive man, and he does everything in his power to help when the group decides to fight against Dracula. Arthur Holmwood is the son of an English lord and aristocrat, Lord Godalming. His wealth ends up funding the battle against Dracula. Professor Abraham Van Helsing, he is an aged Dutch polymath doctor with a wide range of interests and accomplishments. He has a ridiculously long string of letters after his name, and that's supposed to be, it indicates that he's very learned and he knows a lot. He's a doctor, he's also a professor, lawyer, philosopher, scientist, metaphysicist, all of that. And the character is now best known as a vampire hunter. So he kind of understands the old myths and suspects what's going on in the story as events unfold. So he kind of figures everything out. So the plot. Jonathan Harker travels to Transylvania to meet with Count Dracula. Dracula had purchased a decrepit castle in England, and Jonathan was bringing the paperwork to finalize the deal. The travel to the castle Dracula is very harrowing and full of mystery. Jonathan makes it to the castle and discovers over a period of weeks that there are strange paranormal events happening there. He witnesses the Count climbing up and down the outer walls of the castle like a lizard. And he also runs into 3 brides of Dracula, the 3 women who are centuries old, and they attempt to kill Jonathan. Dracula imprisons Jonathan at the castle and leaves him to his doom. Dracula then begins his journey to London. While Jonathan is gone, Mina Murray worries about her fiancé. She stays with her friend Lucy, and they try to comfort each other through their difficulties. Lucy is dealing with her mother being ill, but she receives 3 proposals on the same day from 3 different men. And she decides to marry Arthur Holmwood, and he will eventually become an English lord. The 3 gentlemen remain friends after Lucy makes her choice. The ship that's carrying Dracula's cargo of boxes of dirt travels to England. The captain's log records the horrifying events that transpire along the way, and no man survives. The ship crashes onto English soil at Whitby, where Mina and Lucy are staying. Locals see a dog running off the ship after the crash. Lucy begins to sleepwalk at night, and Mina tries to keep her from getting hurt. She has to find Lucy a long way from the estate one evening and brings her back home. We find out later in the text that Dracula is stalking Lucy throughout all of this. Jonathan then manages to escape from Castle Dracula and finds his way to a hospital in Budapest. Word is sent to Mina, and she travels to him. They marry immediately upon her arrival. While Mina and Jonathan are away from England, Lucy becomes severely ill. Dr. Seward is brought in to look at her and determines that her disease is beyond his ability to treat. He calls on his mentor Van Helsing, and Dr. Van Helsing and Dr. Seward try to save Lucy, but after a very long battle, they end up failing. Dr. Van Helsing suspects there's something strange going on, and Lucy's blood loss and death could only be explained by supernatural causes. And he requests that he and the other men go to Lucy's grave and check on her corpse. They end up discovering that Lucy has been changed into a vampire, and Van Helsing decides to put a stake in her heart, cut off her head, and stuff her mouth with garlic. And they do all of this in order to save Lucy from an eternity as a vampire. Mina and Jonathan return to England, and Jonathan is still very tormented by what happened to him. He and Mina find out what happened to Lucy, and they decide to join with Van Helsing to hunt down and destroy Dracula. Dracula attacks Mina Harker and forces her to drink his blood, and she slowly begins to become a vampire. The only hope for Mina at this point is the death of Dracula. They track down all of the boxes of dirt that Dracula transported to London and purify them with holy sacraments, the wafers used by the Catholic Church. They force Dracula to run back to Transylvania to the castle, and the group manages to beat Dracula to his castle. They also destroy the women vampires and kill the Count. And that's the end of Dracula. I mean, that's the really quick synopsis of the whole thing. There's a lot more that actually ends up going on in the book, kind of in between, but those are the kind of the major points of it. So my thoughts on this book. I absolutely love this book, although I am a big fan of vampires anyway. That's just how I have always been. I think that I was sort of introduced to vampires through probably Dungeons and Dragons, if I had to guess. And maybe before that, just kind of popular culture references in cartoons and other media. If you love vampires, if you love anything to do with horror, I think that Dracula is required reading. So many other books and movies have been adapted from Dracula. I mean, Dracula himself is the archetype of the vampire, of the noble vampire. This book defined the power of the vampire. The book is not really as sexy as you would think if you happen to have watched Francis Ford Coppola's adaptation of it. That book is way sexed up. I mean, it was the 90s, so I think everything was sexed up in the 90s to a certain degree. So you would assume there was a lot of like steaminess going on in the actual text itself, but there really wasn't. I think perhaps for Victorian times, it was fairly racy. There are a couple of moments of intimacy in it. Intimacy in the way that, like, the Count attacks Mina, forces Mina to drink his blood. He makes like a cut on his chest and forces her face to his chest. It describes men and women sleeping together, but very briefly, not in a graphic way whatsoever. There's kind of an intimacy that goes on when they're trying to save Lucy from her fate and giving her blood transfusions. There was kind of an intimacy in that. It may have been a little taboo to the audience at that time, but I'm not really sure. The characters in this book are really, really strong, and they're well developed throughout the story. Van Helsing and Dracula, as I mentioned earlier in the introduction, have become archetypes, and they are used over and over again as, different people take the story of Dracula and adapt it to what they want, and create new stories out of that as well. Many of the female characters that are in vampire fiction now have drawn on Mina and Lucy as inspiration. These characters have become staples. They are the epitome of what those characters are like now in other books. So really solid storytelling. The epistolary narration style is really unique, and I personally have not read another book in this style, and I'm interested to see what other authors have actually used this style. So I might actually try to find more out about this epistolary narration style and see. There might be some really good books in this style. I think that pretty much covers it. It's an awesome book. Pick it up, read it. If you don't have time to pick it up and read it, you can always watch, any of the 30 plus adaptations that exist out there. The story of Dracula is very well known. It's not a difficult read. The text is very clean, very concise. It's not flowery whatsoever. There is some description of the background, the backdrops. Not a lot of description of like the physical attributes of the characters themselves. You end up kind of just picturing them in your own mind of what they might look like. But it can be a very fast read, especially if you get really into it. The first half of the book I flew through. It was a very fast read. But then we had to travel to Las Vegas, and I picked up Jane Eyre. And then I couldn't stop listening to Jane Eyre because Jane Eyre was just so good. And so I put this down for a few days and listened to and read all of Jane Eyre. And then once I got finished with her, I picked this right back up again and got through the rest of it. It's a very fun text. It's a very good text. I had a lot of fun reading this. So I did not give it 5 stars, even though I am a really big fan of vampire fiction, vampires in general. I decided I would give it a 4-star because I think it's more like a 4.5 to be perfectly honest, but I gave it a 4. I will not probably be going back to read it again anytime soon. I just don't have that strong desire, where with a book like Jane Eyre, now that I've read it, I actually almost want to read it again, like right now. This, I don't have that feeling, so I'm kind of just going off of that feeling, that desire. Jane Eyre, I desired to read that book. So anyway, I think that is it. I hope you all enjoyed. If you wondered, when I put out a little bit of an advertisement before this video, and it was me, pouring wine into a glass with the book sitting out on the table and the candelabra in the background too. And yes, I did spill wine on my copy. There's a little bit of schmutz on it. I don't know if it'll show up at all, but I got a little bit of wine there. I got a little bit of wine on the front, a little bit. But it's not bad. It didn't stain it. And honestly, I think it was totally worth doing that for the promo. Because, I got this secondhand. It was, I think, $10 off of eBay. So it didn't bother me, really. I may get the cloth-bound editions when I start collecting those and get my library actually together. But I do like how these paperback editions have these interesting colors on the back for the for the Penguin English Library editions. I think they're really cool, but it's not ruined at all, so it's still perfectly good to read. Anyway, thank you so much. I am almost losing my voice, so I apologize if I sound absolutely terrible. I tried to have a cough drop in my mouth while I was reading stuff to you earlier. But thank you again so much for joining me, and I hope you enjoyed this. Bye-bye.